With my father and stepmother off on their honeymoon with her daughters, I'm left alone to ensure they don't return to my house. At 22, I hold the deed to this house, inherited from my mother after her sudden passing from a stroke last year at 47. I've since found peace with her loss. My parents divorced when I was 7, with shared custody dividing my time equally between them. My connection with my mom was stronger. She was more attuned to me. My dad, now 50, always prioritized work and romantic relationships, leaving me feeling overlooked. I rarely had his undivided attention, but I coped as long as I had my mother. A few years ago, just after I turned 18 and began college, my dad relocated to Houston for work. Our contact diminished, limited mainly to holidays. 2 years ago, during Christmas, he introduced us to Julia, his girlfriend at the time, a 38-year-old woman who brought along her 2 daughters, 18 and 16, from a previous relationship with a high school sweetheart. This was unprecedented, as he'd never included girlfriends in family events before. We extended a warm welcome to Julia and her daughters, striving to make them feel at ease. The evening was enjoyable, and we all got along remarkably well. Subsequently, Julia would always greet me warmly during phone calls with my dad. Her daughters were reserved, but our overall relationship was positive. Following my mom's death, I discovered she had left me the house in her will. Presciently, she had organized her affairs around my 18th birthday, always prepared for any eventuality. As a recent graduate, I opted to move in and seek local employment, cherishing the comfort of my childhood home. My dad, upon learning about the will, was visibly unhappy. Despite his and Julia's support during the funeral, his disappointment over not inheriting the house was palpable. This was the marital home my parents bought together, but my mom retained it in the divorce settlement. A fair compromise, since she waived alimony after sacrificing her career to raise me, allowing my dad to concentrate on his work. With help from her parents, she rebuilt her life, ensuring I never felt neglected. His displeasure didn't concern me much then. I was grieving, and his feelings about the will were trivial compared to my loss. My mom left him her wedding jewelry and all his gifts to her, which should have sufficed. He returned to Houston with Julia weeks after the funeral, and I lived alone. 6 months ago, he informed me of his engagement to Julia and their desire to marry here. To avoid hotel costs, he proposed staying at the house with Julia and her daughters before the wedding, a reasonable request given the extra rooms and their homeschooling arrangement. I consented, welcoming the companionship and shared expenses. I planned to return here in the weeks prior to the wedding, as it was impractical to reside in a hotel while there was a residence with ample unoccupied rooms. Her daughters were also educated at home, so there would be no academic disruptions. I concurred with him, and thus I consented to have them all move into my dwelling and stay with me until the wedding for several reasons. I was weary of living in solitude, and I had a good rapport with Julia, so I saw no issue with allowing them to live with me. Moreover, my father pledged to cover half of the expenses with me during their stay, which meant I needn't concern myself with overspending on that front either. Thus, they moved into my home approximately a month ago and have been here since. Their presence was pleasant, and I felt significantly less isolated than I had when living alone. I believed I could acclimate to this, even anticipating with a bit of sadness the eventual departure to their regular lives, which would mean a return to my solitary existence. However, 2 weeks ago, 3 days before the wedding, my father requested a private conversation and inquired whether I would consider letting them all reside here permanently. This was completely unexpected, but he clarified that his intention in returning was to help me feel more at ease with the concept of being part of a family and living with him, as he disliked the thought of me being alone in this house. His plan involved gradually acclimating me to this idea, and now that he sensed I was adjusting well, he wanted to gauge my willingness to make this a lasting arrangement. I was inclined to agree immediately, but his demeanor when he realized he wouldn't regain the house was somewhat perplexing. Although I was very open to the idea of a permanent arrangement, I had reservations about making such a commitment so soon, and I was wary of letting my emotions dictate my actions. I recognized that this was the only logical remedy to my profound feelings of loneliness, but that didn't necessitate allowing them to move in with me, and it had only been a month since they began living here. Therefore, despite my strong desire to accept, I informed him that I required some time for consideration. It was an intuitive sense, but I had a conviction that it would be prudent to deliberate further and avoid a rash decision. I set aside my personal sentiments and informed him that I would communicate my decision after the wedding. He appeared disheartened but refrained from pressing the matter. 10 days ago, they finally wed, and we thoroughly enjoyed the wedding festivities. They were to remain here for a few more days following the wedding before returning to their home, so I was getting ready to communicate my decision, which was along these lines. However, before I had the chance, they departed for their honeymoon without any prior notification, 2 days post-wedding. I awoke to a completely empty house. Everyone had left. Many of their possessions were still in my home, so I attempted to contact them, but no one answered for a considerable time, which continued to cause me concern. I had intended to share my decision that very day, but I couldn't reach them for hours. Eventually, around midday, Julia responded and nonchalantly mentioned that they had all gone on their honeymoon and would be away for a week. I was taken aback, as I naturally assumed they would at least inform me of their plans before simply leaving, even if I wasn't included. I felt slighted that they hadn't consulted me, but I didn't want to appear petty, so I began by inquiring why no one had informed me of any of this. She offered a weak explanation, claiming they had simply forgotten to tell me, but she reassured me not to worry as they would return soon. I attempted to convey that this was not the core issue at all, and my concern was their abrupt departure without any communication or farewell, which I found discourteous. I expressed a desire to speak with my father, but at that point, her tone shifted, and she informed me that my father was occupied and unavailable to talk. I maintained my composure and requested that she inform me when he was free so that I could contact him directly. I conveyed this politely, but she reacted aggressively, abruptly transitioning from pleasant to quite harsh and unkind. She stated that my father would be unavailable for the next several days and implored me not to disturb them. She continued, asserting that there was no need for such a dramatic reaction just because they had left without me and felt compelled to remind me that I was no longer a child. My father now had a new family, and I needed to come to terms with that. She expected me to cease being self-absorbed and tidy up the house for their return. I was uncertain who she believed she was addressing, but she was certainly not going to speak to me in that manner. She abruptly ended the call after that, and my anger reached its peak. I decided against calling my father then, grateful that I had not accepted his proposal before witnessing this facet of his new wife. There was absolutely no possibility they would reside with me. Therefore, I gathered all their possessions, packing them haphazardly and carelessly into several cartons, and placed them in the yard for them to discover upon their return. I was unconcerned about the fate of those items, as they did not belong to me, nor did they belong inside a house that was mine. Subsequently, I resumed my life as usual, attempting to dismiss the sense of betrayal I felt due to my father's actions, which seemed entirely unprovoked. They finally returned from their honeymoon yesterday, and fortunately, I was at work when they discovered their belongings in the yard. I had also replaced the door locks in the interim, preventing their entry. My father was exceedingly irate when he contacted me regarding the situation. He accused me of behaving like a spoiled child and overreacting, as they did not consider leaving me at home without notice to be a significant offense, and they had done nothing wrong. I simply instructed him to collect his boxes and depart, threatening to involve the police if I found them on my property upon my return. He hurled insults at me before ending the call, but I had to return to work and could not afford to dwell on the matter. Upon returning home after work, I observed that they had taken their belongings and left, leading me to believe the ordeal was over. However, the most vexing part was yet to come. Around midnight, my father called, stating that Julia wished to speak with me. She expressed remorse for her previous words and retracted her statements. She desired a second chance to make amends and did not want a rift over such a trivial matter. I told her to cease talking and leave me in peace, as I had no need for her insincere apologies. I am not naive and could discern the reason for her sudden desire to feign a harmonious family dynamic now that I was refusing to allow them to live with me. If she truly regretted her actions, she would not have waited so long to realize her error and would have apologized immediately after that phone call that day, or even during their vacation, for whatever that was worth. I am certain my father harbors no regrets either, but upon realizing I was not going to forgive them, he opted for a sentimental approach, accusing me of being heartless for not permitting them to live with me. He reiterated his willingness to share all expenses if I allowed him to move back in, emphasizing his desire to reside in this house because it evoked memories of my mother. Thus, he argued, it would be incredibly selfish of me to expel them in this manner without considering the potential repercussions, as his sole intention was to reconnect with my mother. He even claimed that Julia had simply experienced a difficult day and did not mean anything she said, and even his daughters missed me, so they wanted me to allow them to return and start anew. However, I was unwilling to accept any of that. I had always suspected my father's interest in this house since the divorce, and now, having witnessed this side of Julia, he was unwilling to take any chances. So I informed him they could not return home, as I was not going to alter my decision. Phone, accusing me of being the most selfish daughter imaginable for not allowing him to live in the house where he had experienced the happiest days of his life. All due to a minor disagreement I had with Julia and their failure to include me on their honeymoon, which was not even the primary issue. He labeled me as petty and cruel, asserting that my mother would disapprove of this unpleasant side of me. Am I in the wrong for refusing to allow my father and his new family to move back in with me after his new wife's mistreatment and their exclusion of me from their honeymoon? Update 1. The comments on my original post were not what I anticipated. Still, I don't think some of you needed to be so rude about it, but I understand the point everyone was trying to make. As for me, I stuck to my decision and didn't let my dad move back in because, honestly, he simply doesn't deserve it. He hasn't been anything but rude to me so far, and I don't need any more of that in my life. It was nice while it lasted because both he and Julia were very kind to me at first, but once I told my dad that It took some time, but their true nature finally emerged. They likely lost patience and assumed they could pressure me into letting them live with me. Fortunately, I'm stronger than that. I prefer solitude to the company of the wrong people. I shouldn't have allowed them to come in the first place. His reaction to the house deed being in my name, not his, should have been a clear indicator of their materialistic and selfish tendencies. As for Julia, I'm glad her senseless argument with me backfired spectacularly. Had she not said those things, perhaps we could have been a happy family. But that's a fantasy now. I won't be fooled by their insincerity again. I was lonely. With my mother gone and my grandparents deceased, I yearned for a supportive family. These individuals are clearly not suited for that role, and I'm relieved I recognized it before it was too late. It's been several days since their departure, but my dad persistently calls and texts since I refuse to answer. He believes I should grant them one final opportunity to rectify things. They don't deserve it. They squandered their chance, and I'm certain they'd do so again, hurting me the most. Taking that risk is pointless. I feel guilty treating my dad this way, but I'm left with few options. You reap what you sow. He never invested much effort in our relationship, so he can't complain when I prioritize my own needs over his feelings, something he never did for me. Update 2. Apparently, my dad's insistence on moving in stems from desperation. It turns out he wasn't on sabbatical as he claimed. He was fired months before his wedding and has been living off his savings, which were considerable. However, after an extravagant wedding and honeymoon, he confessed to Julia they couldn't afford to return to Houston. He couldn't pay the rent, and Julia, having quit her job to be a homemaker, couldn't contribute financially. Now they need a place to stay, and my dad simply assumed I'd take them in. Julia was oblivious to all of this, which explains her lack of apology. My suspicions about her insincerity were correct. She's as fake as they come, but she's the kind of wife my dad deserves. Today, he contacted me, requesting they stay for a few days until he finds a well-paying job. I refused. Their unpleasant behavior is not something I need in my life. He's an adult. He should have known better than to have a lavish wedding and honeymoon without secure employment. I understand the desire for outward displays of wealth, but that's for those who can genuinely afford it, not for men with a stay-at-home wife and 2 teenage stepdaughters. He knew his responsibilities but chose to ignore them. That's not my fault, and I refuse to feel guilty for prioritizing myself. They can manage on their own. This isn't my problem. I texted him a more polite version of what's written here, avoiding any mockery. He, however, perceived it as such and warned I'd suffer the consequences. I didn't respond. At this point, Anything I say will be twisted into my fault, so silence is best. Let him wallow in his self-created misery. Update 3. My dad decided to leave the city today. Instead of departing quietly, he and his wife opted for a dramatic exit, typical of their personalities. We last spoke about 3 weeks ago, with no further contact since. Today, both he and Julia texted me, excitedly announcing that Julia's ex-boyfriend is sponsoring their return home and offering them a place to stay. He's apparently decided he needs to see his daughters. Julia had full custody, with her ex paying child support, but he was always too busy for his children. He waited for Julia and my dad to resolve their situation, but realizing their incompetence, he stepped in to clean up his own mess. Good for his daughters, I suppose. At least some fathers step up, even if belatedly. They didn't explicitly state all this, but it's the only logical explanation. They posted a picture of their daughters a few hours ago with a lucky clover and 4-leaf clover sticker caption. I'm perceptive enough to connect the dots. I'm trying to decipher the real reason behind Julia's ex-boyfriend's sudden generosity in funding their trip home. It seems odd that he'd cover all their plane tickets. I suspect Julia's manipulative and obstinate nature played a role. I've witnessed that behavior firsthand. While the specifics are unclear, I'm relieved they're leaving, hopefully for good. Reading other people's stories here about their difficult families has given me perspective. My situation could be much worse. My dad is too image conscious to try anything harmful, knowing I wouldn't hesitate to involve the police. I'm also confident in my ability to defend myself, so there's little to worry about. Their departure brings even more peace of mind. Hooray for me, I guess. Lingering loneliness still surfaces, but instead of dwelling on it, I'm turning to my friends for support, a much healthier approach. After my mom's death, I isolated myself, unaware of the extent of my loneliness until reading the comments here. It will take time, but I'm determined to make the most of my life. I have a stable job, a decent income, and my own home, thanks to my mom. Advantages many my age don't have. I'm grateful for that and for my caring friends. Honestly, what more could one need? And if trouble arises again, I'll return here for the helpful advice of this community. Update 4. Today, I received a not-so-unexpected call from my father. He'd been relentlessly trying to reach me through messages, social media, and calls. Curiosity and a desire for him to stop finally prompted me to answer. It had been months since our last conversation, so I anticipated an interesting exchange. Hearing his voice after so long was surprising, but his news was astonishing. Julia, he told me, had decided to reunite with her ex-boyfriend, the same one who financed their return. Apparently, things hadn't gone as planned with my father, leading her to rekindle her previous relationship. My father was devastated and seemed genuinely remorseful for everything that transpired. He asked for a chance to reconcile and rebuild our relationship. However, given the past, I felt indifferent. The stress and pain caused by his and Julia's actions had extinguished any desire to allow them back into my life. I expressed my regret, but my decision was final. Despite hearing the desperation in his voice, I remained firm. I couldn't disregard the pain they had inflicted. Since then, my father has persisted in his attempts to contact me, but I've blocked his calls and messages. While this might be difficult for him, my own well-being must take precedence. That's all for now.